You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast featuring some of Indiana's most fascinating men and women whose impact has shaped our state, our communities, and us. Join us as we discuss their imprint on our history. Leaders and Legends is brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated, your local veteran business enterprise specializing in public relations, media relations, public outreach, crisis communications, and digital photography. My name is Robert Bain, Principal of Veteran Strategies, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor Greg Ballard, and Communications Director for the Indiana Republican Party. I'm honored to be your host for our discussion. You're listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, the Crown Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at historic Union Station, the McGinley Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is Michael Browning. And on the list of people who have made a difference in this city for the last several decades, he is at the top, if not the very top. He personifies what it takes to build a great city, build a great neighborhood, and build a great team. Very few people work across the aisle and across lines and build a better coalition than Michael Browning. We're very happy to have you here. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I'm flattered.
Well, we're flattered that you would take some time to talk to us a little bit. The theme, for lack of a better term, of the podcast is how people came together to build an Indianapolis that, quite frankly, didn't exist 50 years ago. And all cities transform one way or another, but Indianapolis particularly has changed. Tell us a little bit about where you're from originally and your career up until the time that you hit Indianapolis for the last 50 or so years.
I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Went to grade school, high school there. My father had iron ore steamship lines on the Great Lakes that was headquartered in Detroit. He owned an amusement park there, a couple of other businesses. I was one of 7 children. My father was one of 13 children. My mother was one of 3. Interestingly, when I grew up, even with all those children, from the time I was born, my grandparents lived in the same house that I did.
Oh, really?
I grew up thinking that everybody grew up with their parents and their grandparents.
Did your grandparents, were they first generation coming over to the United States?
My grandparents were.
They came
my
from?
My parents were Ireland.
Came from Ireland?
Yes, in my 23andMe DNA test, I was 88% Irish. I could have told them that without paying $100, but
has that been confirmed by the McGinley Golden Ace and
I don't know
various other Hibernians?
The 8% Italian, which did surprise me. So.
You were lucky enough to go to a pretty darn good college.
Yes, I went to Notre Dame. Very fortunate, majored in finance. Graduated in '68. Great class. Great friends there.
That's not a bad time to be at Notre Dame. There was a fellow who arrived in '64 who changed things quite a bit. Were you on campus when Ara Parsegian became coach?
I'm sure it was part of it, but he and I came at the same time, so I know that.
Who recruited whom?
The Ara came. He got recruited really in the winter before, and when. But most of his recruits from that, the recruiting period was shorter back then, but in '64 when I entered, that was the year of John Hewart, a Heisman Trophy winner, Jack Snow, John Carroll, just a great list of guys that year won. They went 9-0-1 and won the national title in one of the polls.
They were 9-0 and went to the Coliseum and were winning, and there was an injury, and they lost 20-17.
No, there was a holding penalty.
Yes, there
They
was a
said
holding
Bob
penalty.
Meeker held the guy at the 1-inch line,
Like
an
a-
offensive tackle. Now, what is this? This is crazy.
Is that a worse call than the clipping call against the Rocket in the Orange Bowl against Colorado?
No, that was worse.
The clipping call that negated the
Yes.
punt return by Rocket Ismail in the Orange Bowl against Colorado. That was a great year. It was a great time. In '66, Notre Dame wins the national championship, punctuated by the 10-10 tie against Michigan State, and then the absolute obliteration of USC. I believe in the Coliseum was 51-0 or something terrible like that. I mean, something great, but a real beating.
The 10-10 tie was in 1966, and that happened in East Lansing. I was there.
You were in East Lansing for that game.
It was very cold, and at the time, it didn't seem that unusual that we didn't go for the home run ball, if you will. It was very cold, very windy. It never occurred to me that we were settling or going for the tie until after the game was over and you started reading the newspapers and listening to TV. Media wasn't quite so fast back in 1966, but when you were there, you didn't think of it like that.
Well, and Notre Dame was losing 10-0, came back and tied it, but they lost their best player getting off the train. Did you know that player?
Well,
Do you know a lot of the football players?
yes, with Terry Hanratty, who was supposed to be the starting quarterback in that game, didn't. And let's see who started.
Coley O'Brien.
Coley O'Brien. He played quarterback in that game, but it was a great ball game. Michigan State had a fantastic defense.
Bubba Smith.
George Webster and Bubba Smith. They were two very big names.
What was it like? I mean, Notre Dame football, and obviously the school was more than about football, but at the time, in the late 60s, Notre Dame was pretty much, I think it's fair to say, the only national program, whether you listen to Lindsey Nielsen redo the games and the highlights every year, but it was a different time for a school that overcame a lot of prejudice throughout the country through its football program. And you were there for its renaissance, you and Era together. What was that like?
When you were as young as I was, you didn't appreciate what it meant historically. Obviously, I was Catholic, grew up Catholic, but the idea that there was that Catholics were somehow discriminated against, that went right over my head. I had no idea of that until after I got to Notre Dame, and you started to hear about some of the history and stories about the Irish in Boston and New York in particular, stories about Notre Dame football being Irish, and stories about Newt Rockne and Frank Leahy and people who held grudges against the university for reasons that are beyond me.
Michigan.
But yes. But I didn't know that when I went to school there.
And you were a kid, a teenager, perhaps maybe just on the cusp, when John F. Kennedy wins the presidency in '60. As an Irish Catholic kid, what did that mean to you? What did it mean to your parents and grandparents?
It was huge in my household. Because my grandparents, again, who lived there, they were Irish. And everybody was terribly surprised, truly surprised. Nobody thought he was going to win. I was a junior in high school, and we got a day off because he won. I thought that was remarkable. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was a junior in high school when he died.
When he died.
Yes, that was That was terrible. That's all we talked about for a week. There was a couple days off there, and all we did was watch TV and watch Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'm eating breakfast watching this on TV. It was amazing.
We try not to date these podcasts because they don't get posted in the order that they are recorded. But we are here on November 21st. So tomorrow is the anniversary, and I believe he was shot on a Friday, and tomorrow is Friday the 22nd.
Yes.
Where were you? You were in school and they stopped school. Talk about how you got the news.
I was out of class, and somebody came down the hallway, I can't tell you who, and said they had just heard that. Well, there weren't TVs around high schools then, and everybody headed for radios, and I went out to somebody's car to listen on the radio. But again, it wasn't like today, and you had an announcer interrupt what he was doing to say, we've just gotten some terrible news. But they didn't report on it. They said, we'll be back when we have something else to share with you.
Sure.
So that's how I heard. Now, when I got home, turned on CBS and Walter Cronkite, and they were full-time on the air. And I don't think I left the TV for 3 days.
Yeah, because the funeral was Friday, and then funeral that Sunday, as I recall, correct? It was very quick.
It was very quick. I don't remember. I was thinking it was another day, but it doesn't matter.
Sure.
Because we had the day of Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald, and we had a day of the Rotunda, and then Arlington, of course. And
you've been to the grave, I'm assuming?
Yes. When I was in the Army, I was stationed in Washington, D.C., and my first assignment, not very long, but was at the Old Guard, the 3rd Infantry, which was stationed at Arlington National Cemetery in Fort Myer.
It's a remarkable. If you have not seen the changing of the guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, you have missed a particular piece of Americana, for lack of a better term, and discipline. It's a remarkable ceremony.
Yes, it is.
After graduating from Notre Dame, you went someplace else for a while. Where would that be?
On Sunday, I think June 4th, I graduated on the main quad at Notre Dame, and when it was all finished and I had my diploma, my mother handed me my draft notice. And I had to be at what they call the AFES office, but in Chicago, even though I lived in Detroit. But I was in South Bend, and they wanted you soon. And
you did a draft notice? Were you part of the lottery then? Did they have a lottery number that hadn't happened yet? That hadn't happened yet.
So I went to Chicago, was at friend's house, and that was the night of the California primary. I watched Bob Kennedy give his acceptance speech of winning the California primary. I went to bed because I had to be at the draft board at 6 o'clock the next morning. Got up, was driving downtown, kind of channel switching, and I heard the end of something about Kennedy shot. And I wasn't thinking about Bobby at all. I was thinking, that's an odd thing to be talking about at 5 o'clock in the morning, talking about John Kennedy.
Yeah, in June, when Kennedy was shot in November, JFK.
So eventually I went back to try and find the station, and that was the first time that I had heard Bobby had been shot. When we got to the AFE station, there were a couple hundred guys there, and you could have heard a pin drop. I was very surprised in that over the microphones in the draft board, they piped the radio in, and everybody listened to it all day long. And in a place where you would have expected a lot of hustle and bustle.
Sure.
again, you could have heard a pin drop all day long, people just listening.
Well, we did a podcast with Mike Riley, whom you may know, who was the director of the 1968 Robert F. Kennedy campaign here in Indiana. And he talked a lot about that night in June and a lot of other things. Were you someone who was active politically at the time? It was heady times for everybody in the country, especially college campuses. And Robert Kennedy clearly was someone who was, I think even his biggest critic would say, was magnetic and a personality that just created enthusiasm. He spoke at Notre Dame during the campaign, and were you there?
I was there. He spoke at Steppen Center. I remember borrowing a car from one of the senior vice presidents at Chrysler Corporation, where I was an intern in the summer, because we needed a convertible for Kennedy, and went up and got it, drove it down. He rode on this in the big parade to Steppen Center. By the time the parade was all over with, probably had $1,000 worth of body damage on it from people sitting on the trunk and sitting on the hood. It got a little bit out of control, and I thought, how am I going to possibly pay for this? And but when I gave him the car back, he was more understanding than I would have been. But so.
Did he get a chance to meet him or shake his hand, talk to him, ask him a question?
I still have a couple pictures of him. I have some good friends that we were all very engaged in his campaign. Went to Mississippi, a lot of time in Indiana. We thought we were heavily engaged. We probably weren't.
Sure.
Mostly get out the vote and voter registration kind of work.
So when he won the May primary in May of 68, did you have a feeling that you had just worked for the next president of the United States? Riley says Riley said at our podcast, he believes Kennedy would have not won the nomination, and he believes Kennedy would have beaten Nixon in 68.
I didn't think he was. Not after the Indiana primary, or after the Indiana primary, I still was not of the belief he was going to be the Democratic nominee. There was still a lot of hard feelings. Lyndon Johnson clearly didn't like Bobby Kennedy, and Humphrey seemed like the heir apparent even then.
Had the establishment backing clearly,
and those were the days of very moderate Democrats, the Scoop Jacksons of the world, and it was just a different time.
Scoop Jackson, the senator from Washington, who was a noted Cold War warrior and protector of the Jewish population in the Soviet Union.
So I didn't. After the California primary, then I had hope. People didn't think of California in 1968 like they think of it today. It wasn't nearly so liberal. It was liberal, but it wasn't off the charts liberal like
Ronald
it is
Reagan
today.
was governor at the time.
So it's so I wasn't there yet that he was going to be the next president.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, the Crown Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at historic Union Station, the McGinley Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. On the cusp of your service overseas in Vietnam, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy happened. Did you get a sense of what you were fighting for overseas when so much of the country was in flames?
Not until you got there. I worked in Washington, D.C. for a year before I went to Vietnam. I worked in Saigon at MACV Command in Vietnam, and gives you an entirely different perspective of war. One of my bucket list items was to go to France and go see Omaha Beach and see the cemetery. And the reason I wanted to do that, sort of going back to your question, is that outside of my window at Thompson Air Force Base was a place where when people died and they put them in the body bags, they literally stacked them kind of in a pyramid. So 10 guys on the first row, 9 guys on the second row, and they would make these pyramids, and a C-131 every day would fly them back to the U.S. That changes your perspective about everything. So even if you thought this was not a war we should be in, a war that you could not understand why we were doing this, why guys were dying like that. When you're there, you temper that emotion, and you're doing your best to win. You're doing your best to help the guys that are there, your best to make sure nobody else dies. So it's it's just very different when you're there. And when you come back, you can fall back into, we shouldn't be doing this, but it's for an entirely different reason. Before I went, it was all political, and it was all
good point,
becoming part of a movement, if you will. And yes, this is silly. Once you've been there, you don't feel that way anymore. So when you come back, you want the war to end because you don't want one more American to die. Being there, fighting for, they had you believing it was sort of the North versus the South, and that's just not the case. There were as many people in South Vietnam that didn't want the Americans there and wanted a singular country. By day, they acted as though they were on our side, and by night, they weren't.
It was a country of extreme poverty. And we did a podcast with Medal of Honor recipient Sammy Davis. I'm guessing you know him or have met him.
I know who he is, yeah.
And he said a lot of the exact same thing, if I recall. Chris, you correct me if I'm wrong, where it's like, look, whatever you think of the war, when you're there and you're in the trenches or you're in the helicopter, you're really just caring about the guy next to you. And how can I help my team and my squad and my platoon and my battle brothers? And all that other stuff just didn't matter. Let's just get out alive. And is it fair to say that's kind of what you were just describing?
That's exactly it. And I remember reading this story one time. Senator Proxmire from Wisconsin had just left Vietnam, and he was back testifying or speaking in front of the Senate, and said he had been there and found out that we were dropping bombs in Cambodia. And he was sort of outraged about it. And I got thinking, well, first of all, I could have asked any one of 50,000 guys, and they'd have been happy to tell him that we were dropping bombs in Cambodia.
It wasn't a secret?
It definitely wasn't a secret. And secondly, we did that because when the B-52s came back and when the bombing runs were over, you couldn't land at Tonsonet with bombs on board, so they would drop them. And the, quote, Ho Chi Minh Trail came down through Cambodia, and it was nobody knew quite where they were, but that's where we dropped them. You could have dropped them in the Gulf of Tonkin, but we didn't. But at the time, I got thinking, what? The spin on this is so different than what actually happened. It was pretty easy to become cynical and sarcastic about the whole political atmosphere.
When did
once
you
you're
leave
there.
Vietnam?
70, or June of 70. Yeah, June of 70.
So you were there
71
when
maybe.
Nixon announced the incursion into Cambodia that led to the protests that eventually led to the Kent State shooting.
Yeah, no, I went to a place called Parrot's Beak, which is
Exactly.
it's in Vietnam, but it's might as well be in Cambodia, and that's where the operation was run from. And so, yes, I was there.
My son, I have a son who's 30 years old, and he's done, he's 11 Bang Bang, or he was before he got out, 11 Bravo Combat Infantryman. He did too. Sound familiar?
I was 11 Bravo. I didn't end up doing that, but that was my MOS when I got drafted.
And he did a couple of tours in Afghanistan. And one of the things that he said to me, and then we'll move on, is you don't talk to him much while he's there, obviously, and everybody has to be guarded. But subsequent, it's like, did you feel like you were doing something over there? And one of the things that he said was, I just don't know. Is that a feeling that you had, like, I'm here risking my life, and why am I here and not in graduate school or back on the block or what any of the other things you could do? You mentioned just a few seconds ago that didn't necessarily want you there. Did you really get that sense, like, leave, Americans, leave us alone?
Saigon was a little different than most places. So there was money in Saigon to be made. There was a pretty robust economy there. So you didn't get that feeling. Now, I had what they called a mama-san who took care of my clothes and sort of maid, if you will. And, so she would tell me what the real world was like. But absent her, I don't think I would have known that nor felt it. If you saw Good Morning Vietnam and the Robin Williams movie and that whole underlying current that, again, that by day they were for you and by night they were against you, and you had the one guy that betrayed him. And I believe there was a lot of that going on. But when you're there, I didn't think that. And if you were talking about why am I here and I'd rather be home in graduate school, you were probably on R&R or you were in a bar at Cam Ranh Bay where you were kind of away from the war for a while. That didn't happen you didn't get out of the mess hall and start talking like that, because there were serious things going on, and you just didn't have that kind of conversation.
Last question before we bring you back to the United States. Is there and we asked Sergeant Davis this, is there a Vietnam War movie that in your mind gets it right?
Well, Deer Hunter was a combination of all of the worst. There was also a movie called We Were Soldiers Once and Young that while that book got written, and that may have in fact been an actual event, and when you talk to people, particularly Moore,
General Moore,
who wrote it, that probably did happen. But most of us didn't go to Vietnam and participate in that kind of a battle. But you'd hear stories like that. But most of it was, I don't want to say day to day, but yes, there was some shooting. Then either you retreated or they went away. The 3-day battles, if you will, or 2-day battles, when those were going on, you knew about them. They didn't usually last as long as the TVs and the movie shows would have you think. It was drudgery out there, and if you were really engaged 4 out of the 7 days, that was a lot.
Well, that would yes, that would be a lot considering what the outcome of failure is.
Yeah.
You left Vietnam, you said, in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
So you're back in the United States. Talk a little bit about what you did when you came back, and then perhaps if you want to just give us your thoughts on how you felt when you were at home watching television in the coverage of the evacuation of Saigon and the end of the war.
For me, once we had the evacuation, it was already a foregone conclusion, and it wasn't an emotional scene for me. It was just get out of there, let's get this done. I thought the POWs coming home was a much more cathartic moment than the airlift out of Saigon. For me, the biggest memory I have is when I came back. Soldiers were not treated the same way they are today. Nobody said thank you for your service.
Which is a scene in that movie, We Were Soldiers. That's heartbreaking at the end.
That's if you were a soldier and you were in uniform and you were traveling, you felt it.
And not in the way that soldiers feel it today.
No. People are much more cognizant today when a guy goes to Afghanistan or a guy goes to Syria or a guy's going to someplace in the Middle East and how awful an assignment that is. And that truly is for reasons that are inexplicable to me. And
do you think being drafted as opposed to volunteering has anything to do with it? In other words, everyone who's served overseas post 9/11 has volunteered for the military, whereas you stated on the day you graduated, here's your induction notice.
Once you were in that whole U.S. versus RA designation, that goes away. At least when you're overseas. Nobody talks about that. Nobody even... that's not an issue. You're part of the team.
Can you shoot straight? Do you have my back?
Having a bad attitude when you're in Vietnam about the war gets you an assignment where you can't possibly do something that's going to get somebody else hurt. You're in the garbage dump. You're in a place where you're out of circulation, if you will.
You mentioned the emotions, and then we'll talk about Indianapolis for the rest of the podcast. I'm assuming you have been. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but what was it like when you walked down the sidewalk where the wall is?
Again, I was. It isn't what I expected, and it was much. It had a much bigger impact than I expected. And having lived in Washington before there was a wall and seen all the monuments, I expected another monument. And yes, I'd seen a picture where it was black. But when you saw it in the picture...
And it was controversial when it first came. It was first created.
When you go there the first time and you've been and you see all those guys' names and the black aspect of it was very, very emotional. And that is an emotion and a memory that I still have. Most of them I've been able to close that book, move on to a different chapter. I remember when Governor Kernan pressed me really hard to go on a State Department POW trip back to North Vietnam. And I said, Joe, I got no demons, and I don't want to go back there and pick it up again. And I didn't go with him.
I was going to ask you if you had gone back, because a lot of folks have. And we was talking about former Governor Joe Kernan, who was a POW in Vietnam. Actually, I have his POW bracelet, and I wear it quite frequently. And I can tell you the date he became a POW was May 7th, 1972. And he's a remarkable Hoosier veteran and legend.
When you're over there and you see pictures of planes that get shot down, like that's why he was a POW, it's amazing to me. Any pilot, whether he went out in a parachute or not, that any of them lived. There was no place to land. It was a mess.
And the ones who got shot down and had to eject over Hanoi or whatever, which I think was John McCain. I think he ejected over Hanoi. I could be wrong, and then they got just abused, for lack of a better term.
Most of those guys got shot. I know that obviously some lived, but I'd say more got shot than went to a POW camp.
Well, before we move on to Indianapolis, we can't thank you enough for your service.
Thank you.
When did you move to Indianapolis?
1976.
What brought you here?
I worked for a construction company in South Bend, Hickey Construction Company, and on their board of directors was Bob Welch. Also on that board of directors was Eric Parsegian.
Oh, you're kidding. Did Welch go to Notre Dame?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Bob Welch was a very, very prominent Indianapolis businessman who was cited by many, has been cited by many as one of the folks who could work across the aisle. He actually ran against Bill Hudnut for mayor and lost, and then they continued to work together. And unfortunately, he was killed with several others in a plane crash about 25 or so years ago.
It was a very close election. I was there and actually didn't appreciate how close it was until somebody showed me recently. But it's so.
Did he become a little bit of a mentor to you, Bob Welch?
Yes, I was. I didn't have any intention of staying here. The company I worked for kind of lent me to him while he was engaged in some political activity, and I thought that I would go back or go somewhere. Indianapolis was not the kind of town I pictured myself living in and growing up. I had lived in Chicago, I'd lived in Detroit, I'd lived in Washington, D.C. I'd lived in South Bend, yes, but I just didn't expect to stay here. But I got lucky. And
when did you start your own company, and what made you decide, you know what, I'm going to be an entrepreneur? Browning Investments is one of the singularly successful companies in Indianapolis and has been for decades, mostly because of Bob Gallant and his leadership, we should mention. But what made you decide to strike out on your own? It's not an easy decision.
Bob had some financial difficulties related to the World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1980.
83?
I think it was 1980, maybe 81. No, maybe you're right. Maybe it was after that. But I bought R.V. Welch Investments from Bob in 1980 or 1981, and we were very small then. And
I didn't know that. I didn't know that Browning Investments was.
Yes, it's in fact, I kept that name for a long time before I changed it to Browning. I don't know why, but it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. I was fortunate in that I had some financial backing from Riley Industries, and we built a lot of office product up on North Meridian, a couple of the buildings downtown. And
you've built some very prominent buildings downtown.
Been very lucky. So 300 North Meridian and Capitol Center. Capitol Center's over 600,000 square feet. That's rarefied air in Indianapolis.
Pan Am Plaza, is that correct? The Pan Am building?
Pan Am Plaza. That was more of a community effort. We didn't make any money doing that. Lilly Endowment was very helpful in building Pan Am Plaza, not the building itself. The Sports Corp was actually the owner of the office building, Pan Am Plaza, and the garage. And so I was I was lucky enough to be involved in that. It financially had a bad ending, or we thought had a bad ending, and then it turned out to be very good for the Sports Corporation, and is the principal. The Sports Corp has a very good reserve, and essentially from the office building in the plaza.
We did a podcast with Ryan Vaughn, the current president of the Sports Corp, and I want to ask you about sports for just a second in a minute, but anyone who knows you knows that your civic resume is without peer. You're up there, and I say this admiringly, with Jim Morris, with Bill Mays, with Yvonne Shaheen, with my guy, P.E. McAllister, and those who have stepped forward beyond their corporate responsibilities and taken on a civic role. You are involved in the Visit Indy organization on their board, the Sports Corp. You were heavily involved in the Pan Am Games and the sports festival that happened in '82. Assess that genre of activity when it comes to the difference between the Indianapolis you never thought that you would stay in and the Indianapolis you currently live in.
That answer could be a very long magazine article. I don't know if I can answer that in 5 minutes. But first, from at least from where I was, Jim Morris is without peer in that regard. He was the guy who went out and made it happen. Now, he had a lot of, Dick Lugar was the mayor and allowed Jim to go out and work on behalf of the city to get it started. And then Jim went to Lilly Endowment, and Tom Lake, who was president of Lilly Endowment then, without him, Jim didn't have the ability to get done what he got done.
Lilly Endowment was a prime funder of the building of the Hoosier Dome.
Yes, although there was a tax that was the big part of the money, but you have to admire the endowment in that virtually every project they ever did, they wanted public money in it, they wanted government money in it before they would put some money in it. And while there's probably some exceptions, almost everything I worked on, that's what I saw. And they were generally the last money in, not the first money in. You knew you had to go out and raise some money, and you had to put some things together, and you had to get the community on board before they were helpful.
If I had told you in the mid-1970s, as you were in Indianapolis, wondering perhaps what the hell you're doing here, and when can I go back to a big city? If I had told you then that Indianapolis was going to throw the watershed, seminal, most highly praised Super Bowl in the history of the NFL, you would have said,
no. I might not have answered the question because certainly
it was so preposterous.
But it.
How proud of Indianapolis were you when that Super Bowl came off the way it did?
The key to Indianapolis' success for most of the events that occurred in the early years was the volunteer core of the city. That's where the credit really goes. When you look at the number of volunteers at the National Sports Festival, our very first event, the number of volunteers at the Pan Am Games, and then you go to the 400 or 500 events we've had since, whether they're Final Fours or whether they're for a ping pong championship that you don't remember. That's the key.
And that's been said multiple times on these podcasts, whether it's Mark Miles or Jim Morris, David Frick, who appeared with us and was phenomenal, Allison Millangton, Greg Ballard. They've all said the same thing. There are headlines, and then there are the people who make the headlines happen.
So what it took to make it happen, you couldn't have thought of. So when it was a guy named Larry Conrad who was heavily engaged in the opening ceremonies of the National Sports Festival, and he was the guy that kept talking about we had to have more volunteers for this, had more volunteers for that. Pretty soon we had a volunteer corps that was bigger than the number of athletes we had coming. But it changed how we did everything, and it truly was the difference in making Indianapolis work as it relates to those kinds of events.
One of the things that's come out in the podcast, which my only experience with was that I had to move out of my barracks at Fort Ben Harrison because I was there at the time, and that's 1987, the Pan Am Games. We had Mark Miles on, who was kind of running the Pan Am Games, and we've actually reached out, and Ted Boehm, who was the overall head for Indianapolis, has agreed to come on the Leaders and Legends podcast. But Mark said this, and so did Bill Benner, someone I know you know, who was a podcast guest, that the Pan Am Games showed the world that Indianapolis could play globally when it comes to sports, sporting events, and putting on something, in this case, very short notice. What is your recollection of the Pan Am Games, and do you agree with that statement?
Yes. We hosted a multi-sport, multilingual male and female event that required 30-some venues, and again on short notice, and all with volunteers. I don't know how big Mark's staff was that was actually getting paid, but it was very few people. And the rest of it was all done by volunteers. So if that didn't show people, well, it did, because we would then make bids on other events going forward, and people believed that we were real. When you think about 2012, hosting the Super Bowl, and you look at the bid and what it took to get the owners to say, first of all, we're going to go to a northern city.
Exactly.
And secondly, do they have the capacity to do this? Do they have the hotel space? Do they have the common area space? We had our resume got us to the table. The people that were there speaking on our behalf and talking to owners about why this could be true, they probably took us over the goal line. But that resume was very significant. It's kind of what you pointed out about the Super Bowl. To this day, most times the Final Four is in Indianapolis. The media coverage all say the same thing. This is the best venue for the Final Four there is. Every time we come here, it's fantastic. It's walkable. The people are so friendly. And that resonated with the NFL owners.
Several months ago in 2019, and we brought this up in the first series of podcasts, but Mike Greenberg, the famous ESPN sports host, tweeted, "Indianapolis is the best big game city in the country."
I remember that. It was Pan Am Plaza. It was.
And you look at the events that are coming, and a lot of folks, and I'm not judging them because I can understand their worldview, but say there's too much emphasis on sports, too much done for downtown, too much done for tourism. As someone who's been involved in dozens and dozens of events stretching back 4 decades, almost 5 decades now, in a position of leadership, what do you say to someone who makes that point?
I love it when people say that, but let me parse it a little bit. First of all, tourism is a very significant industry for Indianapolis. There are some, I think the number's close to 60,000 people engaged full-time in the tourism industry, whether it's in the hotels, whether it's in the restaurants, whether it's in the convention centers, whether it's at the airport and the piece that's associated with that. That's a business that deserves our attention. And so I'd sort of like to separate that away from the events. Back in the late 70s, when our population was in the maybe 700,000, we visited with the top 20 employers in Indianapolis and asked them what the city needed to do to make it better for them. And the overwhelming answer was, we have a very hard time recruiting people to come and live in Indianapolis and work for our company. So the sporting movement, if you will, had nothing to do with sports. We were looking for a way to promote Indianapolis as a quality of life opportunity for families, as a place to live, as a place to where you could participate in things that maybe you couldn't participate in other communities. And this was a Jim Morris strategy that extended to all of our not-for-profit institutions, extended to Conner Prairie, extended to the Children's Museum, to the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And out of that came an idea that really started with the Clay Court Championship, make the event a better event, and it worked. So then we tried to find two other events that would work, and that led to the National Sports Festival, which, here we are today. Now we're going to host the college football playoff, which is sort of mind-boggling when you think about it, and the NBA All-Star Game and the Final Four in 2021, those three events. It was about putting Indianapolis on the map so that when people came here, they would want to stay. So here we are 40 years later, and the problem companies have now is that people don't want to transfer. They're like me. I love this town. I can't think of a better place to raise a family. And while it wouldn't pertain to me, I would never agree to a transfer. We see that a lot. And that's a pretty remarkable happening in, call it, 2 generations. So I don't agree at all that was not a good thing for Indianapolis. Tom Lake used to say, you can't be the suburb of nothing.
And then Mayor Ballard, when I worked for him, was always like, look, we have to have young people who want to come here, stay here, have kids here, educate their kids here, and convince their kids to stay here.
The goal is still the same. If you don't have growth, you die on the vine. And
is this a true or false statement? Other cities throughout the United States, and perhaps the world, but let's focus. Other cities throughout the United States would love for Indianapolis to have less emphasis on tourism and conventions.
Oh, that's true. We are a very strong competitor. When I became chair of Visit Indy, I don't think we were doing 500,000 room nights, and now we're doing 900,000 room nights. And that's a big deal. So the crew at Visit Indy is second to none in this country. They are very, very good at what they do.
And Leonard Hoops and Chris Gall have agreed to come on the podcast. I can't wait.
Well, that's good. That's good.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, the Crown Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. We end all podcasts with the same 5 questions. Michael, you ready?
Sure.
What was your first job?
I was a paper boy.
I think
delivered the Detroit News in the afternoon.
I think Paperboy and Lawn Cutting are the most popular ones, at least among the men.
When you're 12, it's all you can do.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
My first concert. Wow. 19. Gee, I should be right at the top of my list.
Did you ever see Bob Hope in Vietnam?
No. He wouldn't come to Saigon. He was
Out in the bush.
He was out in the hinterlands. The first concert, I think either Johnny Rivers or the Four Tops, maybe.
In Detroit or at Notre Dame?
And Johnny Rivers at Notre Dame, the Four Tops in Indianapolis, the Temptations. There was a lot of the Motown sounds was founded in Detroit, and when you say concert, it's not exactly how I saw them. They were much smaller venues, if you will, but it was probably one of those groups.
If you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend? I know you're a history buff.
Well, only because I've just been to France. I read a bunch of Stephen Ambrose books, and it's whether you're reading about Vietnam or whether you're reading about World War II, reading a book of history about your fellow citizens who died, I think is a worthwhile endeavor. I'll leave it at that because I can't come up with one that I think I would put my name on.
Answer. Not everyone I know can make it to Normandy. It's not the cheapest trip. Fortunately, I've been there, and it's beyond overwhelming.
When you walk in that cemetery, it is not what you think. And it just, wow.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I almost went to the inauguration of John Kennedy. I would have liked to have been there for that. I would have liked to have been in Rome for the election of this Pope. I think he's going to change the Catholic Church in a way that's long overdue.
Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. Last question.
A Jesuit, which is really surprising. So that's
Question number 5. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record to discuss anything, whom would you choose?
Colin Powell.
He's been mentioned more than once. Mm-hmm. Did you know him in Vietnam?
No. I just think he has a unique perspective that's not warped. He wasn't trying to build up a portfolio of things that he could talk about to sort of support his position. He was always good at taking a step back, and good or bad, he would say so. I thought Bill Clinton was a very good president. I think he got a lot done for the country. But now that all the history books about him have been written and all the revisions have occurred, I don't know if you could ever have the kind of conversation you'd like to have with a guy like that, where you got the level set, if you will.
He's a history buff as well. We cannot thank you enough for your time. We cannot thank you enough for everything that you have done, not only for the city, but for the people of this city. And I can tell you one thing is true. If you want to get something done, if you want to build a coalition of people who will work selflessly to make Indianapolis a better place, a more attractive place, you have to call Michael Browning. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.